observations in the workplace, which is a area that our team do get asked about quite frequently. So what I've tried to do is pull together the kind of most common areas sorry, we've got more people joining quite rapidly. Hold on, I'll just let them in. Popular this morning. Sorry, so there we go. I've tried to pull together the most common areas that we do get asked about on call and just give some information on those areas and pull together some best practice tips as well. So we're going to start off just looking at the legal context, really just a kind of basic look at the different types of religious discrimination. And then we're going to focus on time off for religious reasons, and I've split that up into both maybe more extended time off for religious holidays, as well as maybe time off and breaks throughout the day for things like prayer, reflection. So we're going to have a look at that. And I've tried to pick some case law as well, just to show you the kind of things that an employment tribunal will think about when an employer's dealing with these types of requests. And then to finish us off, I've pulled together some best practice tips for employers, just from some quite useful EHRC guidance. So when we're speaking about religious discrimination, before we go into the examples and the tips, I think it does help just to know a bit about the law and the legal context itself. So don't worry, I won't take us through really in-depth sections of the Equality Act at 8 in the morning, but I'll plan to just go through, a very brief look at the different types of discrimination where religion can factor in, so that it makes sense when we talk about the tips and we can basically see what it is that we're trying to avoid. So religion or belief is a protected characteristic in the Equality Act, which is where, the bulk of discrimination legislation is contained. But it's quite wide-ranging because religion or belief as a protected characteristic, it covers those who have a religion or belief, but it also equally covers those who don't share that religion or belief. So I think that's quite an interesting element, because when you're making decisions, you're really trying, not to discriminate against those who have a religion, but also not give sort of favourable treatment that might hold those who are perhaps an atheist at a disadvantage. So we'll look at some examples of that later on, and how that's dealt with in case law. I also just wanted to mention that you'll see it's religion or belief. So we're not really going to be covering that or belief part today, but that would be those who hold what is called a philosophical belief. So I've had a look and pulled out some things in case law that have been held to be a philosophical belief. And that's things like veganism, gender critical beliefs have also recently been held to be a philosophical belief. So these types of philosophical beliefs will be given the same level of protection as a religion itself under the Equality Act. But it needs to be something that's weighty and worthy of respect in society. So there is tests they apply to become a philosophical belief. You can't just say anything is and expect protection under the Equality Act. But we're not going to cover that today. But it is quite a topical area. So if that's ever something you'd find interesting, let me know and we could plan something later in the year. So the two key areas of discrimination where religion or belief will factor in is direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. So taking a look at direct discrimination first, that is where a person A discriminates against another B if, because of a protected characteristic, A treats B less favourably than A would treat others. So I appreciate that that's the language lifted straight from the Equality Act, and I appreciate that sometimes statutory language, it doesn't always make it, it's crystal clear. But really that is when an employer, someone in an employer's organisation, treats another less favourably than they treat others simply because of that protected characteristic. So I've pulled out some examples to illustrate how that might take form in the workplace. And all the examples today are pulled from things like ACAS guidance, the Equality Commission on Human Rights guidance, and case law. So the first example there of what might be construed as direct discrimination is refusing a job application, even though it's the best one you have on merit, because they've disclosed somewhere in the process that they're a Catholic. It could be not promoting a high-performing colleague because that colleague is Muslim, and you don't think the requirements of the religion are compatible with the requirements of the senior role in the business. And if you remember back to one of the previous slides, I'd mentioned that those who don't follow a particular religion are protected under the Equality Act. So I found an example of that, and that would be, perhaps it's an organisation where it's kind of Christian-led and Christian-run, and an atheist employee is consistently given a lower bonus than the Christian employees, despite them performing just as well. So that is all kind of examples of direct discrimination. And the key thing to note here is that there is no justification defence. So when we look at indirect discrimination in the case law, you'll see that there's an opportunity for an employer to say, yes, we had to make that decision. Yes, we had to, reject that holiday request, but we had to for business reasons. We had no other way to do it. That's not possible in direct discrimination. If a tribunal finds on evidence that one of these things in orange is taking place, that will constitute direct discrimination, and there would be no defence to lessen that or to get out of that. I would like to think that direct discrimination is probably a bit less common where we are in 2025, just because you'll probably see from those examples that it's a bit more, it's just a bit more explicit. Whereas you would hope now that no one would be, outwardly biased or, outwardly critical of a religion. But I think where it probably might factor in is some people have things, unconscious biases, and that might show in their decision making, even on a kind of covert or unconscious level. So it still kicks in those types of scenarios. But what is a bit more common, I'd say, in case law is indirect discrimination. Indirect discrimination is a bit different because where that occurs is when an employer might have a policy in place. And you'll see in the case law, they call it a PCP. So it's a policy, criterion, or practice. And that's something that they would apply to everyone in the workforce. So a PCP might be something like, all full-time employees must work a 5-day week, or a PCP might be that, you don't allow flexible working in a certain shift. A PCP could be that from, May to July, employees aren't allowed to take annual leave. All of these things, these kind of workplace rules, whether written or not, could be classed as a PCP. And the key thing is that they're not just applied to someone with a religion, they would be applied to everyone in the workplace neutrally. But where the discrimination creeps in is where, although it's applied to everyone, it has the particular effect of disadvantaging a certain group with a protected characteristic. So for the purposes of the day today, we'll be looking at, where an employer applies that policy widespread across the workforce, but it has that inadvertent effect of disadvantaging religious people. So unlike this direct discrimination, you can play the justification defence to this type of discrimination. You've maybe heard before of the test of having a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a PCP in place. It might very well be required for your business. It just needs to be, proportionate. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail of what that looks like. So some examples of religious indirect discrimination, again, that I've taken from, kind of official guidance. You're Jewish and you finish early on Fridays in order to observe the Sabbath. Your manager has changed weekly team meetings from Wednesday afternoon to Friday afternoons, and you're therefore often absent. So, that could mean in turn missing information. It might impact on performance and progression opportunities. Could be missing out on information related to training. So you can see there the PCP would be that team meetings take place on Fridays and not Wednesdays. that rule might not necessarily be a bad thing if there's, a really strong business reason and there's absolutely no way they could move it. Not sure how likely that would be, but in that scenario, that could be an example of religious indirect discrimination. And the second one is that an employer decides to give their employees a longer lunch, but for giving them the longer lunch, they remove their smaller morning and afternoon breaks and consolidate it into one lunch break. So they do this to their intention with this is to improve productivity. This applies to everyone in the workforce, but it causes a problem for some Muslim employees because previously, they'd used their breaks for prayer that they have to do at certain times throughout the day. So again, that's likely to be indirect discrimination because it puts the Muslim employees at a disadvantage. So in saying that, I'd spoke about how with direct discrimination, there is no justification defence. If it's occurred, the employer would be liable for that. But indirect discrimination, as I mentioned, is a bit different because you can be found to have had a PCP rule in place. It can be found that that PCP did put people with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage, but it might be what the employer is saying is that having that in place while it had that disadvantage was necessary for the business. So that would be called objective justification and having a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So if you have that kind of rule in place that, might cause disadvantage, you really want to be assessing whether or not there's a genuine business need for having that rule in place. So it need to be quite strong, evidenced need. So, do you have customer output requirements to meet? Maybe that person works on perhaps a piece of machinery. There's health and safety requirements, they can't go off on their own. It would need to be a really strong business need. And the other thing to think about is, can you achieve that business need through a way which isn't discriminating against that group? So there's actually an example recently where it was a Sikh employee who wore a turban and he worked in a kind of kitchen setting. And what his employer said was that, everyone must have no head accessories on and wear a hairnet. So that inevitably went to tribunal on the basis of indirect religious discrimination on the basis that he was, told to remove his turban or he couldn't work in that area. And what the tribunal actually said was, of course, achieving food safety and hygiene in a kitchen environment is a legitimate aim. But they determined that it wasn't proportionate because he could have worn a freshly washed turban every day. They removed him from the environment or required that if he didn't remove it. But what they didn't do was think through, all the alternatives that they could put in place to avoid having him to remove his turban, which is obviously extremely important in the religion. So because they didn't take, any steps to look into other ways to achieve their aim, it wasn't held to be proportionate. So going to now apply that to kind of time off for religious reasons in handling, requests for different types of kind of religious holidays, things like that. And we will look at case law as we go through. That gives more examples of the indirect discrimination and how that works in practice. So just some reasons that, religious people might require time off from work. It might be for prayer or reflection. That could be, throughout the working day, or it could be, a longer period of time they're requiring for a religious festival or to attend a religious service. Other things I've seen in case law are things like attending important religious pilgrimages where they might need an extended period of time off work. And the key thing here is that there is no legal right to time off work for the above. But although an employee might not have the legal right to get that time off work straight away or automatically, they obviously can make a request for that time off work. And it's the handling of that request that employers need to be careful with, because if it's refused unreasonably, it could amount to direct or indirect discrimination, like we've just discussed. So quite commonly an employee, if it's if it's a festival or a pilgrimage, an employee might request annual leave. This can be particularly difficult if it's a widely celebrated religious holiday and you've maybe had an influx of requests at the one time. But the key thing is just to consider, every request for religious reasons in full, and not reject unreasonably. Rejecting a request for holiday, could amount to indirect religious discrimination. So that point I just discussed about making sure you have that justification in place, the objective business reason, that will be really key. If you're in a situation where it looks like you do need to reject. But I would say before rejecting, I would, exhaust every other option before arriving at that decision. One I've seen come up, as an employee requesting annual leave for, a religious festival, Eid, something like that, but they don't have enough annual leave to cover it. So in that scenario, it might be offering as, unpaid leave, um, so that they can get the time off, but it's not going to be paid annual leave. So thinking of, a flexible option like that before rejecting. Um, Other issues that you might face is that it might not be the best time business-wise for that employee to take annual leave. Maybe they're working on a specific order or, a specific project. Um, so something to consider might be whether or not the employee can have the time off and make that time back up when they return. So I would focus on being flexible, um, and have a sense check before, every time anytime you're going to reject leave that's been requested for religious reasons. It might be worth taking a bit of advice, and it might be worth just going through in your mind, do I have that objective business reason? Is it proportionate? Is there anything else I could do here, that's less discriminatory than flatly rejecting that holiday request? So a case that kind of demonstrates this is J.H. Walker against Hussein and others. So the PCP in this case was that the employer said no holidays could be taken between May and July. That's because that was a particularly busy time for the business. But the Muslim festival of Eid fell in the May to July bracket because there was just kind of blanket ban on taking holiday during this time. A number of Muslims in the organisation brought a claim of indirect race discrimination. So here, the employer did argue the kind of justification defence, that we spoke about previously, and said that they had a sound business reason. But the issue here at both the Employment Tribunal and the Employment Appeal Tribunal was that the employer hadn't balanced the needs of the business against the needs of the employees. So there needs to be some sort of give and take and consideration to, the what both the employer and employee find important. And this was because the employees, when they were getting pushback about taking this annual leave, they'd said that they would make the time back up. And if there was any backlog caused, they would do, the extra hours to reduce that backlog. They would work those hours. The employer hadn't taken this into account and still rejected. So in that case, a finding of indirect race discrimination was made. There might also be times where an employee's requesting time off, but rather than a prolonged period of time or a full day, some religions do require prayer a certain number of times in each day, or at certain times within the day, set times. And again, you'll see the theme here. It's all about dealing with reasonably and just trying your very best to accommodate that request while balancing it with those who, don't have religion, and ensuring that they're not at any disadvantage from the arrangement. You should try and find somewhere quiet in the workplace that they can pray, somewhere clean, quiet, and as private as possible. I know some larger employers will actually have meeting rooms on site, but that's not always going to be practical for an SME or a smaller employer. So something like an unused meeting room would be appropriate for that. And again, if someone makes a request and it doesn't look the best business wise, it's all about just trying to be as flexible as possible. Um, so if they're going to be taking some time out throughout the course of the day, can they start work earlier? Or can they stay on later to make up the time? I think that also helps. Obviously, you don't want to be giving someone additional paid breaks because of their religion, because that means someone who doesn't follow that religion, is almost at a disadvantage because they're not getting as many paid breaks. So I think that also helps, if you have any grumbling that someone's going off and taking these consistent prayer breaks through the day, they can advise, everyone here is working the same amount of hours in a day. And that would be because, they're just starting a bit earlier or working a bit later, but everyone's working equal hours, equal pay. I think it keeps it fair. Other ways you might accommodate it might be shortening the lunch break, um, to allow them to have other breaks throughout the day. And that would, facilitate the prayer better. And another case on this kind of topic would be Esther Nino against Zoran Jokic. And in this case, the claimant was a chef and he was dismissed for refusing to work Sundays. So he was actually a Roman Catholic. And the teachings he followed obliged him to abstain from, all working on Sundays. So in this case, the restaurant was genuinely becoming busier. So the tribunal did accept that there is a legitimate business need here to ask him to work extra hours, extra days, and that is proportionate, to ask an employee to work extra shifts. But where they fell down, so where their justification wasn't successful, is that they couldn't provide any evidence that they did that extra step of exploring all other options before going down the discriminatory route. So what they didn't do was they didn't speak to the other chef on the team and say, can you commit to working every Sunday or any Sunday we need you. They didn't look into those other ways to avoid Mr. Eston, having to work Sundays. So for that reason, it wasn't proportionate. Their business reason wasn't proportionate, and they failed. So again, I think it just highlights the need to, if you're in a situation where it looks like you're having to reject or not allow something, you really want to be able to demonstrate that you have explored all avenues before deciding that you have to take this route. So just to finish on some best practice tips, I was looking and actually found some really useful guidance from the EHRC, and they call this tips to have a faith-friendly workplace. Um, so I picked out some key tips there that I thought were quite useful from that guidance. So the first one being, in the workplace, it can be easy to just have all your social activities involve, alcohol, or, a night out. But what they've said is providing a range of social activities means that you've got an increased chance of appealing to everyone in your workplace. Some religions obviously, don't allow alcohol or permit alcohol. So making sure you have some activities for the team which aren't centered around alcohol is advised. Not having an overly restrictive dress code is another tip that they've put on their guidance, just because with some religions there will be requirements for them to wear, different items of clothing, could be different headpieces. You really want to have a dress code that's inclusive. Of course, there'll be health and safety requirements there within your dress code, especially in this industry, but just having a sense check your dress code to check whether or not there's any angle that it could be indirectly discriminatory. Another key thing is just having an awareness in the workplace that some cultures will have different, norms. So that could be things like handshakes and direct eye contact. So in some religions, it wouldn't be appropriate to shake hands, to make direct eye contact. So I think just having that awareness that that is a practice of different cultures and religions, and making sure that someone's, not held at any sort of detriment for that, So, you know, it's not rude. They're not penalised for it. You know, it's just a cultural difference. We spoke about this one in detail, but just making sure there's somewhere for prayer, and that there's some flexibility around how breaks can be taken. An awareness that some religions might wish to avoid contact with certain foods. So that would be, you know, if you're holding some sort of corporate event or lunch, just making sure that you're going somewhere that caters, you know, for all dietary requirements. That might be halal offering, kosher offerings, vegetarian options. Consider holding meetings at times suitable for fasting employees. So, you know, that would be people who are fasting might be experiencing, you know, tiredness, fatigue. So I would be working with these employees to make sure that when you're scheduling meetings, it's at an appropriate time, avoiding meetings later in the afternoon. I've already covered the halal and vegetarian options. And as we've touched on in detail today, accommodating annual leave, unpaid leave to celebrate religious festivals. So that is what the EHRC say are the kind of key points to put into your working practices, you know, to be mindful of faith and, you know, avoid religious discrimination. These slides will go out to everyone, so I've pulled together some kind of key resources. So certainly we've got our Scottish Engineering Employment Guide where we write a lot of this out and kind of user-friendly information for members. It covers everything from this to, you know, disciplinary processes, holidays. If anyone doesn't have access to that, feel free to give me a message. It's available to all members if you take services or not, but I can make sure you get the login to access that. And then I've linked the ACAS and EHRC guidance on these issues. You'll notice I've mentioned them quite a lot as I'm going through, and they are quite, you know, helpful, and they're written in a digestible way. And in terms of training that we offer, our employment law essentials goes into, you know, really fine detail on different types of discrimination, legal tests, case law, a bit of like what the beginning of this was like, but in more depth. So if that's something you'd be interested in, we offer that. And then we also do offer, you know, your general ED&I training. That's open to kind of HR and for managers. And then before questions, I have a favour to ask. We don't normally ask for favours on this, so hopefully you'll hear me out. We've got our Scottish Engineering Pay Survey, and we've extended the deadline to the 10th of March. I don't know if anyone's ever participated in it, but you fill it out. It's an Excel spreadsheet this year with the salaries against the relevant job codes, and only people who fill it out get a copy of the updated survey. So it's quite useful if you're doing any sort of pay benchmarking or salary reviews, because you'll see what other people in the industry are paying for certain roles. So if you've not got that in your inbox, you can contact Debbie. Her email address is there on the slides and you'll get a copy of it. So just a favour to ask that you'd consider filling that out for us. And does anyone have any questions before we end? I'll hang on. I'll hang on at the end, just for a couple of minutes if anyone does have any questions. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amie.
Thank
Well done.
you.
That's great, Amie. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Bye.
Thanks.
As you probably guessed, I've got one.
I know that voice anywhere, Janice.
Is my
Hold on,
camera on?
I'll pop this recording on.
Okay.